All right, what's good, everybody? Welcome to season three, episode four of Black Men Need Love 2. I know. Y'all probably been wondering where I've been at. I've been around. Life has been life thing, but of course, it's me, your boy, Dr. Cloud. You already know who I am. No need for introduction. If you don't know who I am, take a look at our website, Black Men Need Love 2. Take a look at our YouTube channel. Go all the way back to season one, and then you'll know who I am. So we can skip the introduction. So today we're going to be talking about black men and abuse, and we have Mr. Watson here. I want to let him introduce himself, and then we'll kind of jump into the conversation.
Hey, how's everybody doing? I am Jamerson Watson. My pronouns are he, him, his. I identify racially as black. I'm originally from Austin, Texas, but currently live in Washington, D.C. on unceded Piscataway and Anacostan land. And for the most part, I'm currently a grad student at Howard University in both the MSW program, Master of Social Work, and the Masters of Divinity program. So I'm getting that dual degree right now. This is my second year in the program. And prior to coming to Howard, I spent the vast majority of my career. A lot of the work I was doing was focused on youth and young adults. So mostly primary prevention around sexual assault and dating violence prevention. But then I also did a lot of work with men who batter, who are in intimate partner relationships, who are alleged perpetrators. And then I also had the opportunity to work with a lot of young people who were being trafficked in the Bay Area in California. And so most recently, a lot of my work has been around domestic violence, fatality reduction, as well as doing some youth homelessness work as well. So I'm glad to be here.
Woo, thank you. So as y'all can hear, we have a subject matter expert. This episode is going to be kind of tough for me because abuse is not something that I'm very comfortable talking about. So I want y'all to know this episode is going to be tough for me. Just only because I'm a black man who's witnessed domestic violence growing up. There was still some trauma that I'm dealing with myself from that. But it's good that we have a subject matter expert who can talk about it as well. And it is kind of dope because as a fellow grad student, as y'all know, I'm a fellow bison class of 2018. So I think I'm an old head now. Look at God. I got my degree. So we're good. So thank you again. So I'm kind of just gonna hop into the conversation and kind of ask you this first to start off. What exactly is abuse and what does it look like?
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question. So, in a lot of the abuser intervention work that I did, we would definitely make a distinction between the definition of abuse and the definition of violent. So the way that we would define abuse is any action or behavior, regardless of intent, that seek to dominate or control someone or keep them from making a free choice, right? So any behavior, regardless of intention, that would seek to dominate or keep someone from making a free choice. And so when we look at abuse, it is a broader umbrella and it seems all encompassing, but I really think that the aspects of abuse that make it important is that piece, regardless of intent. Because we know we've all grown up having experiences, whether it's abuse that we had at the hands of one of our peers, right, or abuse that we had at the hands of a primary caregiver or maybe a secondary caregiver, or even those of us who maybe were in relationships before where there had been abuse in the relationships, or with a lot of the young people that I trafficked, where that abuse actually went to be considered human trafficking because they were either transported somewhere or they were coerced into committing sexual acts. Or for some of them, it was also, labor trafficking as well. But I think that aspect of regardless of intent is the hardest part for people to get around because they really think that, oh, well, I didn't intend to hurt that person, or I didn't intend to try and dominate that person, or I didn't intend to try and control that person. But it's regardless of the intent.
Ooh. I never knew the distinction between it before. Even as a child protection social worker years ago, and I used to have domestic violence cases, I never understood the difference between those two, and I could never distinguish them. And it was one of my biggest, I want to say, like issues, because I would be like, well, how is this abuse? How is this violence? How we kind of putting this into a category of the child is in danger or the family's in danger? And my supervisor could never give me a straight answer. So
Right.
I like having that difference, the differentials.
Yeah, and I think to your supervisor's credit is that when we look at abuse under a legal definition and we look at abuse under more of like a cultural, social, or moral definition, the definition that I give, we would have, if you take it into different jurisdictions, like law enforcement agencies at different places, because we would often see this. I was able to do like anti-rape work in Texas, Illinois, and California. And if you went to all three places, the definition of what would actually get a law enforcement response, which we never really wanted a law enforcement response, but that's a totally different subject that I don't know if you want to get into or not. But like if there was a criminal legal response, the definition actually mattered. And so we're talking more of a universal definition that we can kind of all buy into, but it's not necessarily going to hold up in certain jurisdictions, if that makes sense.
No, and I get you. So let me ask you this then, because you were going somewhere and you came back from it, and I want us to touch it. So let's talk about the legal component of it that you just talked about. Take us there. Kind of give us a rundown. We want to go there. We want to hear from all sides. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I acknowledge first and foremost that I have been both. I've had the fortune of working directly with law enforcement, but I've also been on the side as I don't, I hate using the word victim, but the victim of a law enforcement response. So it's that duality that, I think a lot of Black men, especially, really have to work through that tension of, in my job as doing social work, having to work with law enforcement and have a relationship with them where we can partner together for this coordinated community response, but at the same time knowing that there's been maltreatment through that law enforcement response. So I think the first thing that I want to say is, when we approach abuse, I think as a society, what we want to do is we want to move away from the traditional crime prevention approach, and we want to move more toward a community coordinated response approach. And what I mean by that is, our inclination as a culture, right, ever for the last 200 years has been, if something goes wrong, if we're in fear, then we call law enforcement, right? And to a certain degree that makes sense, because we've all been in situations where we want to call the police, and at the same time some of us have also been in situations where the police have been called on us even though we weren't doing anything, right? And so I think that because that tension exists, I think as a culture, we want to move away from that traditional crime prevention approach, which not always, which most of the times has a law enforcement response component to it, to a community coordinated approach, which is where we as a community, right, we as neighbors, we as family members, we as loved ones are both supporting each other and holding each other accountable in situations where there is alleged abuse.
And so, woo. So let me ask you this, and this is going to be one of those questions where I have to play devil's advocate, I guess,
Absolutely.
in a little bit. So you said that oftentimes some of us have either been involved in these type of things, what we call law enforcement, and you yourself have been a subject of law enforcement as well, in these type of situations. So why do you believe that when it comes to these abuse cases, or when law enforcement call out to like domestic violence, sexual abuse, those type of crimes, that it's believed that the man is the natural perpetrator versus who it actually is? So it's always the Black man. So why do you think that is?
Yeah, so that's super complicated, right? Because we definitely live in a culture where um we can look at recent examples as well as historic examples of where Black men have been accused of crimes that we know they didn't commit, not just because the evidence showed that they didn't commit the crime, but we also know that there's a pattern of behaviors here in the United States culturally where Black men are explicitly accused of doing things that we've both proven they didn't do, and we also know that it's based upon these kind of these old tired worn out tropes and stereotypes, right? We look no further than, like, we look at cases like lynchings that happened back in the 1920s, the 1930s, and even up to, I mean, we always think of Emmett Till as like the kind of like most horrendous example. But keep in mind, for every Emmett Till, there were Black men across this nation who were lynched because of a thing that they were accused of doing that we know they actually didn't do. So I think that we have almost a cultural what's the word, like there's almost this cultural instinct because of these tired old tropes that have been played out over and over again, right? We look at the first kind of like widely distributed film, Birth of a Nation, which was what? It was this whole like trope of Black men being over sexualized and wanting to, having this desire to like acquire like the, you know, this the cult of true womanhood, which is white women, right? So film industry, the whole industry of Hollywood was based upon this whole this archaic trope, right? So I think we can't get away from it, right? It's embedded in our movies, it's embedded in television, it's embedded in books that we read, it's embedded in, like, it's almost embedded in our cultural psyche as a country. So I think that that's the reason. Then when a law enforcement official responds to the scene, they are using old information to go into a new case, but they don't even some of them do consciously realize it, but they don't even realize it because it's been so deeply ingrained in us in this country.
Woo. Yeah, yeah, and you're right. And I always wondered, and maybe you can give me some insight, since this again is your niche. So why do we often believe that Black men or men in general cannot be victims of abuse? That we can be sexually assaulted, that we can be victims of domestic violence, that we can be, victims of any type of abuse. People are always saying that abuse is just physical and sexual. There's other type of abuse as well, emotional abuse, mental abuse, and all of that as well. But why do we have this? I know you talk about the troops and the stereotypes, but why do we always believe that men can't be the victims in these situations, especially for sexual abuse and domestic violence?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really great question. I think that, so my gut is to say it's because Black men in this country hold a very particular place. It's like this unique niche where we are both invisible and at the same time we are the boogeyman, if you will, right? So in one case we're being ignored, right? Like, you you're walking down the street, you ask somebody for the time, they act like you're not there, they just ignore you, right? Like when you have needs, when you go to the hospital, the doctor is just like, oh, they're going to skip over you and they're going to go to someone else, right? Because you're invisible. But at the same time, if you're walking down the street and someone's afraid, what are they going to do? They're going to walk on the other side of the street. Or if if you have needs and you're like, and you express those needs, then everyone's like, oh, wow, this angry Black man is here and he's a threat to me. So I think because both of those things exist simultaneously, it's like, this is the rock, this is the hard place, and Black men, I think, are caught in between it. So then when sexual assault or sexual abuse happens, we have a hard time in our mind fathoming, right? Like, how could someone who's supposed to be the almost embodiment of a perpetrator, how can they then be a victim? Because in our minds, we've already said they aren't victims of crime, they commit crimes.
Woo, and it's true, and I think that's the sad part. In my work that I've done, I've met many of Black men who have been victims of abuse, but they're so afraid to talk about it. And so, why do you think that they're so afraid to talk about it? And I know you said that because we're supposed to be these big masculine men, and we're the protectors and stuff like that. But why? What do you think additionally is the barrier? What is the barrier that makes us so afraid to talk about the abuse that we have witnessed, been through, in our lifetime? And what do you think? How do we work our way around that barrier to make sure that those Black men are getting the treatment that they need to overcome that type of pain?
Yeah, no, I think that a lot of it is rooted in this kind of self-fulfilling, like the self-perpetuating, like, idea that we always have to be strong. And if someone is strong and that's the assumption, then they can't possibly be the victims of abuse. And so I think because both that idea is out there, and to a certain extent we buy into it because we know that there are consequences to us not buying into it, right? Like how many of us have been like, how many of us were bullied growing up, and so we knew that we had to toughen up. And we're not just bullied by our peers in school. We have older men who are teaching us, hey, you need to man up. Hey, men don't cry, men don't let other people hurt them. So then if we are hurt, then in our minds, it's what? It's our fault. And so because we see it as our fault, even though we know that especially any child that is abused, they are not at fault. But for some reason, we've created this system where because Black men are supposed to be strong, and because they aren't supposed to be taken advantage of, when they are, ultimately it's because they allowed it to happen to them, right? And so I think that because we both fall victim to that, and we to a certain extent buy into it, the whole notion of going to someone for help or going to someone for support, it almost doesn't exist for us. And who are the very people we're supposed to go to for support? The police. So if I know that the police are, and I'm not saying this is the case for all law enforcement, but if I've had situations growing up with law enforcement where for other people in other communities, law enforcement is there to protect and serve. For a lot of Black men in this country, law enforcement is patrolling us. And so as a result, I'm not going to go to the people as a victim that I think in my mind have been charged with patrolling me my whole life.
Yeah, I avoid the police at all costs, y'all. I don't want to find out that I avoid the police. I avoid them like a hooker looking for her money. I avoid the police. So I really like what you're saying. And when we are dealing with Black men or just men in general who have suffered some type of abuse, and I'm going to take it category by category. When we're looking at physical abuse in Black men and those who have suffered physical abuse, exactly what are the ramifications of that going left untreated or unaddressed, as they matriculate? So, say if the abuse happened in their childhood, and what is the ramifications for them as a teenager and adulthood, as in later in latent stages or late adulthood? What are the ramifications?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think the thing that we need to point out first is that almost all of the research shows that at a young age, so we're talking before the age of 12, boys and girls are abused at about the same rate, right? And I think as a result, we then have this whole culture of young boys who grow up to be men who were boys who have been abused, but the data doesn't show that they've been abused. Why? Because they didn't go to anyone, because they didn't have an outlet, because because therapy wasn't available to them, because they felt like they didn't have a safe person to go to, because they felt the guilt and shame around, like, I may have caused this abuse to happen. And so I think because of all of this, there are obviously the physical consequences, but then there are also the behavioral and the psychological consequences on a lot of our young boys that we completely miss as a culture, right? Like when we look at for example, hypersexuality, right? A lot of that is as a result of having been, and I'm not saying all of it, but a lot of it is related to the abuse that young boys suffer or young men suffer when they were actually boys. When you look at issues of aggressive behavior, right? Like we always hear that hurt people hurt people. A lot of these young men who are on this this school to prison pipeline is because they were abused when they were younger and they were never able to deal with it because either no one knew or people knew and they just didn't have that kind of trauma informed response that we talk about in the field. There's obviously like psychological, beyond aggressive behavior, there are other psychological consequences, right? We know that, when it comes to issues like educational issues, for example, right? Like there's a decline there's a direct correlation between young men who graduate from high school and young men who were sexually abused when they were younger, right? Like, so we know all of these things that we talk about as being markers of success. A lot of them are, a lot of times Black men are put at a significant disadvantage because of abuse that did happen when they were younger, but specifically unaddressed abuse, right? Like, we know that when abuse is addressed, then we're able to help young people to talk through it, either through things like play therapy or through traditional talk therapy or through other modes. But if it goes unaddressed, then that's where we then see a lot of the consequences psychologically and behaviorally down the line.
Mm. So I'm gonna have us um, talk about the sexual component now of abuse. So we talk about the physical, physical sexual abuse can fall under physical abuse as well. But I want to talk a little bit more about the sexual abuse part of it. And the reason I want to talk a little bit more about the sexual abuse is because I think so often we leave that unaddressed too, right? We be like, oh, boys can be abused, they can be sexually abused. Oh, you let somebody play in your booty hole, or vice versa. Or you're gay for letting it happen to you, and it leads to this trauma, right? This mental trauma that we've been talking about throughout our whole conversation. So, how do we recognize when a male, black or a black male, has been sexually abused, and how do we get them to talk about it? And also how do we get them to engage in healing from their trauma?
Yeah, no, great questions. So I think first and foremost, it's important that we ask questions. I
Mhm.
think that's something parents are often afraid to do, especially parents from who parented my generation, because you would often hear this notion that I don't want to ask the question because I don't want to know the answer.
Mhm.
Right. And so that's where you get a lot of situations where maybe there's an adult who's close to that young person who the parent actually knows who've abused them. And you oftentimes don't, you have a parent or a primary caregiver that doesn't actually believe that the person that they know or the person that that child was close to was actually sexually abused. So sexually abused by that person. So first of all, it's asking the right questions, right? Second of all, it's saying certain things or using certain coded language with the young people, and it's not coded at all. It's actually like quite apparent. So first and foremost, I believe you. It's very important. I think we're afraid to tell young people that I believe you because we know from our experience growing up that sometimes young people, because young people are still in those very early stages of both like their moral and cognitive development. We know that, like, you know uh we used to call them when we were younger telling stories or telling tales, right? Like, we know that that's something sometimes that young people do because you're still kind of constructing and weaving how to talk about your experiences, right? And so things happen out of order sometimes, or sometimes you may associate something with one person that was actually another person. So we think that these like typical normal like phases of cognitive development, we think that they carry over into sexual abuse. And the data shows that it doesn't. When a child says this person did this to me, very rarely is that young person actually concocting or making up a story that actually didn't happen. And so
Mhm.
it's very important that we tell young people, I believe you. Even if we have doubts in our minds about the way that they told the story, that's for a professional to handle, right? So that's when we go to sexual assault counselors, crisis counselors, play therapists. There are people who can talk to a child and help them to construct the story that the way that it actually happened. We don't have to play that role as parents, caregivers, or other people who are interacting with that young person. So I believe you. Second of all, it's not your fault. It's critical that we let young people know that it's not their fault, because it is never a young person's fault if they are sexually abused or abused in any other type of way. So I believe you. It's not your fault, and I'm here to listen, right? So oftentimes, especially we see this with Black parents, because we're so afraid of what the world does to our young people, we always want to have answers for them. But sometimes you don't have the answer. Sometimes you just need to listen to what that young person is saying. So it's very important to do those three things with young people. I believe you. I am here to support you, and I believe you. I'm here to support you, and I just said the other one. I believe you. It's not your fault. And I am here to support you are three critical messages that we need to give to young people. And we need to let them know that we're not just telling them those things in a moment. Because here's the thing. Oftentimes what will happen is we'll have like maybe parents might have a particularly like a kind of like conflicting relationship with the young person. So as a result, we then want to make our support for them episodic as opposed to always being there to support, because we often think that support only means I'm here to comfort you. I'm here to listen. I'm here to buy into everything that you say. And those things are true, but also with support comes accountability. So I think that parents are afraid, if I always tell that young person I'm here to support you, I believe you, I'm here to listen, then no matter what the situation is, we always have to come with that same energy. But it's very important that we kind of create a pattern. We establish a pattern of doing these three things with young people, so that when something does happen, they're willing to come to us and say, hey, I really want to talk to you. I hope you're not going to be mad at me, but this happened. Or, hey, I really need to tell you something, but I need to know that this is a safe space. Like, every young person knows that, or every young person wants a safe space to be able to confide in someone, but we have to create a safe space, not just in a situation where someone has been abused.
Mm. Mm. Woo. That one hit me right there. And I'm very big on safe spaces, right? And I'm very big on Black men having safe spaces as well. And you said something earlier, and I was listening to you, and I was just in my head, I was agreeing with you when we were talking about how the prior generation, right? Our parents, grandparents, great grandparents, how they kind of looked at abuse and stuff differently. And it took me back to like telling the story. And I remember I had a client, and he said something to me, and it triggered something in my memory. How what happens in this house stays in this house, and how often that when abuse goes on in the household, that we keep it in the house, we keep it inside the house, because we
Yep.
don't want society to know that we got this going on in the house, or we protect the perpetrator, and
Mm-hmm.
then the child doesn't feel protected, and then you wonder why the child has the aggression, the sex, the hypersexualization. They have all these other issues as well, and it is kind of wrong in my head. Like, when we look back at this, why were our, I ain't gonna say me, but why were the generation before us, why were they so comfortable with protecting the perpetrator of the crime versus protecting the child? And why now has this narrative shifted, as we are going into these new generations, as some of us are becoming parents and raising our children, that the narrative has shifted. So where did that culture shift, where did that kind of shift of abuse come from, versus what happened in this house stays in this house, to now, if somebody touch you, you let me know. You not going to, you can't go to nobody else, because I don't know them, I don't know their people, I don't need nothing happening to you. It's shifted, and I've seen this shift, and I've heard it, and I've heard this shift in conversation. So when I'm trying to figure out, when did this shift actually happen?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really great question. So I think the first thing for me that comes to mind, as far as why our parents and our grandparents protected the perpetrator, I think a lot of times it was out of fear.
Mm.
And I think that it was, number one, fear that if that person did this under my watch, then I am culpable. So I can't believe that that person did this, because if I believe that they did it, then I also have to believe that me as a parent wasn't protecting and keeping my child safe. So I think fear was the first thing. And I think fear actually took two forms. So fear of me being complicit, but also fear of the system. Like, I think, and rightfully so, if I had, like, let's say you had an uncle growing up and your uncle was the abuser, and your mom, as the sister of the alleged abuser, she then knew that her brother was going to prison for a really long time. So I think that there was fear of the way that the system would protect him, or I'm sorry, that the system would react to him, and the system wouldn't protect him in the same way that they may protect like a white uncle who did the same thing. And
Mm.
I'm not saying this is necessarily true. I mean, I do think it's true, but I'm not
It's
saying it
true.
is. I'm saying that that is the fear that I think a lot of Black women specifically, but also I think Black folks in general had. So fear that I might have been turning a blind eye to my own child's abuse, fear of the way the system would treat the alleged perpetrator. But then I think third, as far as fear goes, is then fear of what would happen to our family. Is this something where Child Protective Services or some sort of social services agency is then going to come in because they think I can't protect my child, right? So I think that fear is one huge reason that you didn't see parents and grandparents from previous generations actually believe, or at least in their, maybe they believed it in their heart of hearts, but they didn't acknowledge that belief. I think that it was a lot of that was driven by fear. I think you're right that we have seen a cultural shift and a cultural change that's relatively new. I'm going to say within the last 20 years max. I'm going to say probably more like within the last 10 years. I think a part of that is our comfort with having conversations that we used to not be comfortable with. And I actually applaud like my parents and then probably my generation in starting to have these critical conversations about what does it mean for children to be both seen and heard. Because remember when we was coming up, I mean, I don't know your exact age, but like when I was coming up, children was what? Seen,
but not heard.
But not heard, right? And so I think that we started to, like, I used to have a guy in one of my abusers groups, and he used to say we're living in a kinder, gentler world. And I think he's right to a certain extent. I think the world has started to develop a better understanding that children are an embodiment of what they experience. And so as a result, if we treat children as just many adults who don't have rights, who don't have a voice, then we're doing that child a disservice, because then what are we doing? We are restricting information, we're restricting strategies, resources, everything that these children have access to grow into mature adults that are not going to make the same mistakes that we made. We've basically just been perpetuating stuff that's happened through slavery, right? Like why did we protect our children? Why did we downplay our children's accomplishments? I mean, think about it. Like in slavery, like if a master came and said, "Ooh, that boy's really good with his hands," what was a parent's natural response to that situation? "Oh, no. He's not good. He's just, you know, he learned that because he's seen like another guy do," you know. We would downplay the success of young people because we didn't want them to be taken. We didn't want them to be seen. And I think as a result, we've created generation upon generations of young Black men and Black women, but mostly young Black men who are just seen, right? Because we want to keep them invisible. So it's almost like it's this weird duality where the way that the culture treats us because of white supremacy, we then respond in kind and treat ourselves in the same way. But I think over the past 10 years, we started to, I think, here's the thing, what I will say about the last 5 years. And I think that this becomes really complicated because, and I am very cognizant and aware of the fact that the person, not growing up with a father in the household, the person that I look to as kind of my primary model for what a father figure should look like, now we know was committing sexual abuse toward women for the last 30, 40 years. And so I think that because of that, because we all grew up basically Cosby kids in a generation where children then were seen as beings who needed to be nurtured, who needed to be developed, but also needed to be empowered. I think that because of that, we're starting to now ask critical questions as parents to say, you know what? Everything that adults do isn't right, even if the way we perceive them to be is correct, right? How many of us watched television for years thinking, oh, if I ever was a father, I wouldn't want to be just like that person. And now we're like, oh, people aren't always what they seem. And I think that's actually opened a floodgate for us to be able to have conversations about what does Black masculinity look like? What are the healthy manifestations of that? And how can we welcome and nurture and empower those healthy manifestations and not just the aberration or the deviation from the norm?
Mm. I had a question, but what you said really did kind of resonate with me. What does healthy Black masculinity look like? And that just kind of that was a question in my previous episode that I had asked. What does Black masculinity look like? And I remember that the young man told me that it looked like me. It's just me because there's no clear
Right.
definition of healthy Black masculinity, right? It's just me, and no matter you twist it, how you flip it, how you turn it, I know what it looks like for myself, and
Mm-hmm.
not versus what everybody else may want to look like. And it's funny enough that what you saying there, because I'm thinking back to a time in my internship. So I used to, when I was a grad student at Howard, my internship was at Synergy Family Services under the direction of Dr. Spencer Simmons. And I remember we did an activity, and it was on domestic violence. It was on domestic violence. And for somebody like me who's never really like dealt with abuse before or really never paid attention to it, we realized, because I broke down crying in the middle of it. Don't know why I started crying. Don't know why I started crying. We had to pause the exercise. And I remember Dr. Simmons pulled me to the side, him and one of his assistants, and he was like, "What's going on?" I said, "I don't know. For some odd reason, I just had like a bad feeling while we were doing this." And I
Huh.
started crying out of the blue. And we sit there and we talk for 30 minutes. He said, "Have you ever been abused or seen abuse in your lifetime?" And I said, "Not that I can recall." And he said, "I just want you to really sit here and try to think back to when you were a child, right? And just ask yourself, are you sure it's something you never blocked out?" And it was something I had blocked out. When I was a
Mm,
younger child, I had seen my dad beat up his girlfriend in front of me. And I remember that so vividly. It was bad. And no dirt to my father because I love my father. But as a child, seeing that and not really understand what's going on, and just seeing how badly beat that she was, and that my grandmother, when she was alive at the time, put me behind her and told my father, "No, he's not going with you anywhere
right.
until you get yourself under control, until you do something about that temper." And I remember my father's girlfriend beat up bad and everything, took me home to my mother. And I remember that when she tried to talk to my mom looked at her and said, "I've been through it myself. I don't know what to tell you." And it's just like you kind of started really thinking about how that type of trauma affects you. Because
Right.
I never really thought about it until I got older. And, I started thinking to myself, that was a reason I think I kind of avoided getting close with people,
Mm-hmm.
or I would avoid certain like relationships because it was kind of like some type of internal trauma that I couldn't really realize until I go into that exercise, because it was a
Gotcha.
memory I had blocked out as a child. And I think as Black men, we often do that sometimes. I kind of call it our disassociation,
Mm-hmm.
because we have experienced something so traumatic, whether it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, that we disassociate so badly.
Absolutely.
Like, and then something happens in our life and it just comes back like this, and
Mm-hmm.
you just trying to figure out, yo, what the hell just happened?
Right.
Like, what happened to me? And you wonder exactly what his trauma came from, and then the memories that start coming back. Like, they start coming back badly. You trying to figure out, how do I deal with this? Because again, it goes back to that whole, I don't want to talk to somebody about this.
Right.
It's that fear. And I really love, as I'm listening to you. First of all, I can hear you present anytime, and I'll probably be like, y'all know what, this is dope. And it's good because when we're looking at a generational, so I'm 29. So my generation is Gen Z, I think. No, millennial. I think am I a millennial?
Millennial.
I'm a millennial. And I don't know your generation. So
You're at the tail end of millennials. I'm at the tail end of Generation X.
okay. So I like that when, as we're having this conversation, I get to see the different viewpoints between your generation and my generation, because me and you are not that far removed. We're probably only less than 10 years of age between each other, if that. And it's interesting to see exactly how we both have these different concepts, or or these different type of ideologies around what abuse looks like for Black men, and what it has looked like, as you like you said. in the last 10 years, the shift has changed.
Right.
And I've had my share of black men who have, started talking about the abuse that they went through, the abuse that they suffered. But it's always one thing holding them back,
Yeah.
and it's dealing with the trauma, right?
Hmm.
They talk about it, but it's the traumas that they don't want to address.
Right. Right.
So I'm trying to figure out, and I don't know how to word the question, so I'm just going to do it my best way possible.
Absolutely.
When we are trying to bring out the trauma in black men, right? When we're trying to bring out more than just them acknowledging that they've been abused, seen abuse, stuff like that. How do we pull it out? How do we make, but in a healthy way, to not re-traumatize, but to kind of promote healing from within, because I've met plenty of men. One of my clients a long time ago, he was sexually abused, and touch was his biggest issue.
Hmm.
His biggest issues. We would have our sessions outside in public where everybody could see us. Right, trying to secure confidentiality, because his abuse had happened in a locked room,
Right.
by his stepfather, and so he always never want to be anywhere where nobody could see him,
Hmm.
and it traumatized him for so badly. So how do we kind of cope that trauma out and to address that trauma, but in a healthy way?
Yeah, no, I think that I think the challenge there is that it's going to look different for different men under different circumstances, right? Like you just talked about this specific client who he knew he may not have articulated it this way, but he knew enough to know that if he were in a closed room, that he wouldn't feel safe talking about the trauma out loud.
Mm.
But the irony is, in public, right? We often teach men like, no, you don't share things in public. You keep everything behind closed doors. You keep everything in private. But when the abuse happens behind closed doors and the abuse happens in private, where do we then go to seek out healing? So for him,
Mm.
he needed to be exposed, right? Like he needed to be out there so that he could look around him, make sure that he was safe. He was aware of his surroundings. I think for some men, it's going to be the opposite. They're not going to be comfortable sharing that type of information, having those types of conversations with other people around. So it's going to be about figuring out what is their safe space. Does that mean a park where the both of you are alone? Is it the alone part that they're uncomfortable with? So you'll need to be like in a room with like very open windows where they can see people outside, but they know that the words that they are saying is not going to be like other people aren't going to have access to it. For some men, it may be that they're like, you know what, this is my darkest secret, the thing that I want to keep deepest down inside and never expose to anyone. For them, it may be like, I need to go into the darkest of places where I can't even see myself, both physically and metaphorically, because that is the only place they are comfortable in sharing that information, right? Like it's going to look so different for every man. But the thing is, we need to listen to them to try and help them strategize around what is going to work for them. Oftentimes, we have a one size fits all for every man who's ever been in any traumatic experience. And what we all need to do is we need to figure out what was the source of that traumatic experience. What does that environment that I'm in elicit from me around that traumatic experience? And then how can I create an environment that actually does the opposite the environment did when I was in that traumatic experience? So it's going to look so different for every man. We just have to actually listen to them and help them to strategize around what that might look like for them.
Mm. Woo.
Which is hard work, right? Like we as social workers, as therapists, as clinicians, we have to put in more effort to do that. But essentially, that's the only way that we're going to put them on a path or support them in putting themselves on a path to true healing is by us doing more work.
Mm. So, woo. I am filled, and it's and I'm reason I'm so filled is because this conversation is one that's very important to me.
Mm,
Talking about abuse, and one for this season 4, I have been focusing on aging with grace, right?
mm,
especially for black men, because as black men, we do not give ourselves grace. I don't know, and I don't know what it is. We do not give ourselves grace to live in the moment, to be happy, to experience joy, to embrace our femininity, our masculinity, to to explore every new opportunity that's available to us because of the fear and the stigmatization that society has put upon us. And as we get ready to wrap up this episode, and we're leading with aging with grace, I want you to give us some advice, about dealing with trauma and abuse as we continue to age with grace and what that should look like. So as we get older, because I'm trying to be like you when I get older. I want the salt and pepper. I want to be, I want to be like y'all. Y'all can't tell I'm in my 50s because I look I'm in my 30s. Because I'm giving myself the opportunity to live with grace, and God been good to me. Okay, I'm trying to age like that. So give us some advice.
Yeah, I love the fact that that is kind of the theme that's in like kind of woven into this season, because I actually posted a few years ago on Facebook. I said I want to applaud and thank every black man who is 50 or older, because there's so many of us that didn't make it to 50. There's so many of us that didn't make it to 40. There's so many of us that didn't make it to 30. And it's not to take anything away from those who didn't make it, because there's a reason. There are reasons that they didn't make it, mostly societal reasons, like, mass incarceration, HIV and AIDS, not giving people access to like the healthcare that they needed, like heart disease. There's so many reasons that so many black men don't make it. CTE, when we look at our young black men who grow up into older black men who have played sports, specifically those brutal body contact sports, there's so many reasons that black men don't make it, which is contrary to like other people in our culture. The median age, or it's not the median age, the average age that a black man, the average life expectancy of a black man is significantly lower than it is for almost all other populations of people, right? So just applauding ourselves when we reach those milestones, that's something, like you were just saying earlier, that's something we have a hard time patting ourselves on the back. We have a hard time giving ourselves grace. That's the first thing we need to do to age gracefully, is we need to celebrate just aging, just living. Like, you being alive right now is an act of resistance, because so many black men didn't make it to where you are right now. So just acknowledging that for yourself and celebrating that. And it doesn't mean like inflating our self-esteem and pumping ourselves up. Oh yeah, I'm all that, right? It's saying, through the grace of God, there was something that you saw in me, something that I had left to do for other people, that you allowed me to make it this far, right? So I think celebrating just like basic milestones like that is a way to age gracefully. I think giving grace and love to other black men, right? Like I just had the fortune of attending the Mid-Atlantic Psychotherapy Association's conference this past weekend, where there were other black men that were there. One of which, shout out to our boy Christopher Bonner, who's in the MDiv MSW program as well. He actually graduates in May. Man, I knew Chris from class, but I didn't really know Chris till we got into a small group together, and we were able to just really bond around that shared experience of being a black man. Because there's how many, like you would probably know this data, the statistics way better than me. What percentage of therapists are black men?
It's less than 4%.
Less than 4%, but we what, like 13% of the total population for black people. So what, black men are like 8, 7, 6, 7, 8% of the population, right? So the fact that there's like less than 3% of us who are therapists, like we need to start applauding each other. If nobody else is going to tell us that they love us, that we're doing a good job, that they appreciate us, that they're glad we're still here, we need to tell each other. So I think black men supporting other black men, like when you look at black men and our relationships with one another, oftentimes our relationships are, and I'm not saying that this is true all the time, but from my experience with a lot of black men, their relationships are built upon some of those like unhealthy manifestations of black masculinity, right? So like, oh yeah, this was my buddy that we were frat, and not that there's anything wrong with the joining a Greek organization, but like, we would be in the clubs together, or we would be, this is like somebody that I used to run the streets with. All of that stuff is cool. but we need to open up the possibilities, and we need to open up the environments that we're comfortable with Black men having relationships with one another, right? Like, so, you know, how many times have we said, oh yeah, this is my boy that I used to watch sunsets with, right? Like, it's something that's so basic, something that we all should be doing, but we're not willing to have those type of, like, for whatever reason, we painted and tainted those relationships as being something other than like the traditional masculine Black relationships. But we need to start embracing Black men, celebrating each other in every regard, in every environment. Yeah, man, this is my boy that I went to putt golf with. You know, oh, this is the guy that, like, you know what I'm saying? We used to do a podcast together. This is, we just need to start opening up the possibilities, the options for Black men to have healthy, dynamic relationships with one another. I think that's the best way we age gracefully, is by having other people who look like us and have shared experiences with us to age gracefully with us in like healthy, caring, and loving ways.
I can feel, and you know what? Before I go to what I'm about to say next to wrap up this episode, I completely agree with you. One of my close friends, we've been friends almost 2 years. Starting adult friendship is hard, y'all. And for some odd reason, me and him are really good friends. He's like my brother now. Took me, I think, like last month or something. He was like, "Oh, let's go out." He was like, "I'm gonna take you to this rose garden I discovered." What? He was like, "You ever been to a rose garden?" I was like, "No." He's like, "Oh, I'm gonna bring some sparkling wine." I'm like, he's like, we're gonna take pictures and stuff. Like, it's fall and stuff. Like, we're gonna enjoy and catch up with each other, see how life been treating you. He was like, you know, I haven't seen you in a minute. And we went, and it was a time. It was like so different. I'm like,
Love
Black people
that.
don't do this. Black men don't do this. I don't
Right.
think I've ever been to a rose garden with one of my fellow brothers before, sparkling wine, eating crackers, talking about our life and catching each other up on how everything going. But it was so dope.
Love that.
It was so dope. And I was like, yo, this is the most fun I've had in a long time. And it was so uniquely, so different outside of my normal scope of things I would do with my friends that I was like, oh, we're definitely going back. Cause it was like, you know, I'm like, you know, and he's one of my close friends who I grew up in a household that says I love you.
Mm,
He grew up in a household where I love you was not often. So
right.
we always have that difference. So when we hang out, I'd be like, I love you, and he'd be like, yeah, and give me a half hug. I'd be like, nah, we don't do this. I'm like, you family now. Like, I love
Right.
you. Give me a hug. And he'd be like, I'm still getting adjusted to that because like your family is a big I love you type family. I'm like, yeah, my family. I grew up in a household that's on love. So
Right.
my dad hugs me, says I love you. So I'm the same way with everybody, regardless of gender. I love you. I'm gonna give you a hug because I want you to know that I'm always gonna be here for you. But this episode has been full, fulfilling, both my words for the day. I'm Mr. Watson, I don't know how to thank you for this episode. I'm trying to figure out the words of appreciation for this episode, and not only for myself because you said some stuff that I think myself that I needed to hear and didn't think I needed to hear,
Mm,
but also that I know that our viewers, when they see this episode, or as they're watching this episode, will also resonate with them as well. And especially the advice about aging with grace as a Black man
mm,
and having these platonic friendships with other Black men and doing stuff outside the norm that doesn't seem to be abnormal, and allowing ourselves to enjoy these moments and experience it with our close male friends.
right.
And it takes me back to a video of this guy of a Black man talking about, y'all, I'm going frolicking. To a field, and he's like, I'm frolicking. He's like, yo, this is dope. And he's just laying out in the grass. I'm about, I've never allowed myself to kind of just do
Right.
something on a whim and be out in nature. So, wow. So before we close out the episode, let's tell our viewers how can they find you, how can they connect with you, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, whatever.
Absolutely. So most people can check me out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. My handle for most of those is Salemo Walk. That's S like Sam, A like Apple, uh, L like Larry, E like elephant, M like Mary, OWALK. It's an allusion to a Ursula K. Le Guin short story. who is somebody I used to read. That's another thing. We just need to diversify the things that we read. Like there's so many beautiful things that are out there that like, you know, not in contemporary things from the past, just things to really get us thinking. So anyway, you can reach me at on all those platforms, just Salemo Walk, or you could just type in my name, Jamerson Watson, and it'll come up in most of those regards. You can also email me as well. Email me my Howard email address. That's jamerson.watson@bison.howard.edu. I would love to connect with all y'all.
Ooh. So everybody, of course, at the end of the episode, I always give y'all advice. I don't have any. He gave y'all all the advice. This episode is brought to you by Black Men Need Love Too and Mr. Watson. And I hope that y'all have got feel like I've been feel. I hope that y'all can all take something away from this episode. As I always tell y'all, hug a black man, protect the black man, love a black man, because all black men need love. I see y'all next episode, and that's it. And I'm gonna stop my recording because y'all don't need to hear the rest of this conversation.
Yeah, 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 yeah.